Hey everybody, I'm going to share a little story with you from the Gospel of Luke. And this is a post-resurrection story. I'm going to read from the Message today. It's the walk to Emmaus. And that same day, two of them were walking to the village Emmaus, about 7 miles out of Jerusalem. This is starting verse 13, Luke 24. They were deep in conversation going over all these things that had happened. In the middle of their talk and questions, Jesus came up and walked along with them, but they're not able to recognize who he was. He asked, "What's this you're discussing so intently as you walk along?" And they just stood there, long-faced. They had lost their best friend. Then one of them, named Clopas, said, "Are you the only one in Jerusalem who hasn't heard what's happened during the last few days?" He said, "What has happened?" They said, "The things that happened to Jesus of Nazareth. He was a man of God, a prophet, dynamic in work and word, blessed by both God and all the people. Then our high priest and leaders betrayed him, got him sentenced to death, crucified him, and we had our hopes up that he was the one to deliver Israel. And now it's the third day since it happened, but now some of our women have completely confused us. Early this morning they were at the tomb and couldn't find his body, and they came back with the story that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Some of our friends went off to the tomb to check and found it empty, just as the women said, but they didn't see Jesus." And he said to them, "So thick-headed, so slow-hearted, why can't you simply believe the prophets, what they said? Don't you see that these things had to happen, that the Messiah had to suffer, and only then enter into his glory?" Then he started at the beginning with the book of Moses and went on with all the prophets, pointing out in the scriptures that referred to him. They came to the edge of the village where they were headed. He acted as if he were going on, but they pressed him. "Stay and have supper with us. It's nearly evening. The day is done." So he went in with them, and here is what happened. He sat down at the table with them. Taking the bread, he blessed and broke it and gave it to them. And at that moment, wide-eyed, they recognized him. And then he disappeared. And back and forth they talked. Didn't we feel on fire as he conversed with us on the road, as he opened up the scriptures for us? So this story is kind of an interesting story. Note that these two disciples, they don't recognize Jesus at all until verse 30, until they sit down and break the bread and they eat. In fact, Jesus even lays out from the scriptures all about the Messiah and what he was to do and what was to happen, but they don't get it. But when they break the bread, in fact, looking at the NIV, verse 30 says, "When he was at the table with them, he took the bread, gave thanks, he broke it, and began to give it to them." And verse 31 says, "Then their eyes were open and they recognized him." These verses are meant to, I think, in some ways, to remind us of the communion, the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper that Jesus initiated before he was crucified, the breaking of bread, giving of thanks. I mean, some of the language is very verbatim from that story. But I think there's also something else going on here, is that, I mean, it's important that they broke bread together, they fellowshiped together, they had food together. One of the things I really have missed with the stay-at-home orders, the quarantine measures, the 6 feet rule that we've had with the COVID-19 pandemic, is being with other people. I mean, you can't even go to a restaurant under the quarantine measures. You can't even go to a restaurant and sit down and eat in the same area as people. You can go through a drive-through, you can get to-go orders. I'm sure my children are sick of seeing me sit across from them eating at the table. I kind of have a habit. In fact, I love my food and my sweet tea, but I miss eating and fellowshipping with fellow believers. At the end of March, Dallas Baptist Church missed a 5th Sunday fellowship meal. Some good food, I'm sure. We'd had some good food, and we would have some good fellowship. You see, one of the things I think we often miss in the hubbub of worship services, or some churches call them worship experiences, is this notion that it's worship is not just singing to God. It's not just reading the scriptures. It's not just praying, but it's fellowshipping with other believers. It's being around each other. And even those who, like me, are a little more introverted than extroverted, I don't necessarily feed off of other people. I don't recharge my batteries around other people, but I need to be around other people. We all do. We're all meant to be relational. In fact, if you look at the story of creation of humanity in Genesis, God created man and said it wasn't good for him to be alone. They needed somebody with him. We were created to be relational, to be around people. And that's one of the things that these disciples were doing. They were being relational. And when Jesus sat down, they broke the bread, they came together. I mean, it wasn't cornbread, but maybe, in modern context, maybe sitting down together over some cornbread and pintos and fellowshipping together. Maybe that's something that we're missing. That's something that we need. It's okay in some ways to fill in the void of fellowship, or have filled in the void of fellowship in the pandemic by using social media. A lot of us are doing that, writing cards, making phone calls, being face-to-face with people. One of the things I'm often reminded of is that most of what we say is conveyed through the nonverbals. Not necessarily the words we say, but how we say it. It's pretty much... So, in other words, a lot of what we mean to say, or what we mean, is conveyed through our facial expressions, our gestures, our inflection, our tone of voice. A lot of these things aren't translated well into phone calls. You can't see somebody's face. You can hear the inflection, things like that. People lower, raise their voice, laugh, but you don't see the facial expressions. You don't see the gestures, the hands, the body language. On social media, Facebook, text, whatever, you've lost even the inflection of voice, the raising and lowering of voice. You miss those things. But it's good to be around people, to have that personal interaction with that alone, of understanding one's conversation with each other. We're not meant to be alone. We're meant to be together in fellowship. And I think it's good for us to break bread together, to be together, to share meals together. And that's something I think of when I see this verse, especially verse 30 and verse 31, I should say, that we're meant to break bread together. We're meant to be together as family and as God's people together, to fellowship together. And I'm looking forward to seeing everybody again and being around everybody again at the end of this pandemic situation.